Good evening, everyone. I am so delighted to be here with you this evening for such a special and important event for United for Children. My name is Shantel Meek, and I am the founding director of the Children's Equity Project at Arizona State University. The Children's Equity Project is a national initiative that aims to dismantle systemic racism and create more equitable learning systems for young children from birth through the early years. We work at the nexus of research and policy and practice and have partners across universities and nonprofit organizations across the country. So we're going to talk today a little bit about dismantling the preschool to prison pipeline. We're going to talk about what it means. We're going to talk about why it exists and how it's perpetuated. And we're going to touch on how we can all dismantle it together through the good work of United for Children and organizations across the country. So let's get started. So let's start with just a brief overview for folks who might not be familiar. So what is the school to prison pipeline? The preschool to prison pipeline is a disturbing national trend that has been in existence for a really long time that represents the shuffling of kids out of the school system and into the juvenile justice and criminal justice system. We know it starts in preschool, and we're going to start talking about that in 1 second and really setting a trajectory, a negative trajectory toward a whole host of negative outcomes, including juvenile and criminal justice systems. So let's dig into some of the data to start. About 15 years ago, Dr. Walter Gilliam out of Yale released the first study ever on preschool suspensions and expulsions. What he found at the time, it was about 2006 or so, shocked the nation. He found that kids were pushed out of school early and often and disproportionately. He found that Black children were much more likely to be the subjects of this push out than their white peers. About 10 years later after that, the US Department of Education released a whole tranche of data that pretty much upheld the same thing. Black children were being pushed out of preschool at alarming rates. What they found is what you see in this graph, that Black boys only made up a little bit less than a fifth of the preschool population, but made up 45% of all boys who were suspended in school. Black girls, the disparity was even worse. They made up about a fifth of girls in preschool and 54% of female suspensions. So when we look at these stark numbers, they shock the conscious, and they did that 15 years ago when Dr. Gilliam released his data. They did that 10 years, back in 2014 when the U.S. Department of Education released this data, and they continue to do that because while we all know, or most of us know that racism is alive and well, it is shocking to know that it is happening to children this young who are just out of diapers. Earlier this year, the Children's Equity Project released a new report looking at the state of equity in young children, and we took those data and we broke it down by state to see how states were faring in this racial disparity. And what we found was that there was a racial disparity and that Black children were over disciplined in every single state in the nation. There wasn't a state where that wasn't the case. And the severity of the disparity varied, of course. As you can see, those, including Missouri with the darkest maroon, are the ones that have the highest, more substantial racial disparity between Black children and their peers. But it's really a problem nationwide in every city and in every state. So we step back from the data and we start unpacking why. So why is this happening? Why do these patterns exist? Why is it so consistent? Why? The question that comes up often, do Black children just behave worse? And lots and lots and lots of research has found that answer is no. There is not a single shred of evidence that finds that Black children have worse, more severe, or more frequent misbehavior than their peers. The other natural question that we hear all the time is, could it be an income thing? Could it be that Black children and other children of color are overrepresented in lower income groups? that may affect their behavior, that may affect suspension, expulsion? And again, the resounding answer to that question is no. Even when we control for income, race continues to be a significant predictor of being pushed out. So what does it mean to control for income? That means that when we compare low income white children to low income Black children are still overpunished. When we compare high income white children to high income Black children are still overpunished. So even when we control for that, when we take that out of the equation, Black children and race continues to be a significant predictor. So what's going on here? What could be explaining these trends? Well, Dr. Gilliam, again from Yale University a few years ago, looked at different factors that are associated with being expelled and suspended. And what he found were what he calls the 3 Bs, that 3 of the most significant factors in predicting whether you get suspended or expelled are if you are Black, if you are a boy, and if you are big, just like bigger or taller in stature compared to your peers. So I'd like for you all to reflect on those 3 Bs just for a second and to think about what those 3 Bs have to do with challenging behavior. The truth is that they have nothing to do with challenging behavior, and they have everything to do with how a child looks. So let's unpack that a little bit. Why does how a child looks, or how does how a child looks, affect our perceptions of behavior and the decisions that we make to discipline them differently? So research has found that on average, adults overestimate the age of Black boys by up to 4.5 years. And that is significant. Go back to my previous slide. We know that being big or being perceived as big is another risk factor, so throw that in there. We also know that we have different behavioral expectations based on different ages, right? I have different behavioral expectations for my 1-year-old than I do for my 3-year-old, let alone a 4.5-year span. So if we are perceiving Black children as bigger or older, then we might have different behavioral expectations, and we might be more harsh when they don't meet them. So number 2, Black children are more closely watched and they're more scrutinized than their white peers. So back in 2016, researchers out of Yale University conducted a study using eye tracking technology. And what they did is they asked teachers to watch a video. And this video had 4 children playing together at a table. It was a white girl, a white boy, a Black girl, and a Black boy. And they were asked to hit the space bar whenever they thought a challenging behavior was about to occur. So they were asked to kind of preempt them. And then they used eye tracking technology to see where the teachers were looking when they were expecting a challenging behavior to occur. The kicker was that there was no challenging behavior at all recorded in this video. It was just 4 children playing. But the teachers used that space bar quite a bit. And what researchers found was that their eyes were significantly and consistently more likely to be looking at that Black boy compared to their peers and predict those challenging behaviors, even though there were no challenging behaviors. So again, if you think about, if you're following and scrutinizing and expecting a challenging behavior to occur with a particular child, with a Black child, with a Black boy, you're gonna find more. So if I followed around my 3-year-olds and I scrutinized every single thing she did, right, I'm gonna find more than if I am generally paying attention to all of my kids, and so that's a factor. The other thing we know from research is that Black children are punished more harshly for the same exact behavior as their peers. A study out of Stanford University that was conducted a couple years ago looked at birth records, and they found the most commonly used name for a white child and the most commonly used name that parents selected for a Black child. And what they did was they developed a fictitious behavior incident report, and they put the name of the fictitious white child and the fictitious Black child on it. And they gave it to teachers and asked them what they thought, what they recommend. And of course, neither of these children existed. And the only difference in the 2 behavior incident reports was the name of the child. And what they found was that for the child with the fictitious child with the Black name, They were more likely to recommend harsher discipline. They were more likely to label them as troublemakers, which kind of gets to this broader concept of placing the blame on the individual, like there's something wrong with you, as opposed to the circumstance or the context, like, oh, that child is just having a bad morning, or something like that. And we see that concept come up time and time again in the research. So 4, Black children are more likely to be punished for subjective behaviors compared to objective behaviors. So what do we mean by that? Subjective behaviors are things that require some interpretation by the adult, right? So things like defiance. Well, how you define defiance can vary. Things like being disruptive versus objective behaviors like biting, or in older kids being caught smoking, or committing some kind of vandalism, something that is objectively true, right? And what we find is that when we just look at the objective behaviors, the racial disparity between Black and white children all but vanishes. And it's really in these subjective behaviors where we are having to kind of use judgment and open the door for bias that the disparities are biggest. So kind of taking all of that together, how does that all kind of contribute to what we're talking about today, right? This school to prison pipeline, who is suspended and who is expelled, and how does that work over time? So we know that kids who are suspended or expelled, they simply miss more learning time. They miss millions of days of school a year, if you look at it nationally, of all the children who are suspended and expelled. And if you can imagine, you're removed from the learning setting, and this becomes even more important in the early grades too. But say you're suspended for 10 days, right? You come back and you're behind those 10 days. You miss that content. That is, of course, discouraging to a child and frustrating to a child, especially if you don't get the supports you need to catch up. And so it's associated with being more disengaged in the learning process and losing some of that motivation. Those kids are also more likely to repeat a grade. They're more likely to be suspended and expelled again in the future. And can you imagine, okay, you lose 10 more days. Now you're 20 days behind. And then maybe the following year you lose 10 more. And over time, those add up, and those kind of cascade and result in a snowball effect almost. So eventually, suspension and expulsion is associated with dropping out of school. As you can imagine, all of these things kind of combined, and are 10 times more likely to have interaction with the criminal justice system. So as we just reviewed, it's not that Black children are behaving any worse, that they are jumping into this pipeline on their own, or that their families are pushing them into this pipeline, or that any sort of decision by anyone, right, in the child's orbit is causing this. It's that the system is shoving them into this pipeline, and it's creating this cascading set of events that is really pushing them into a negative trajectory, for no fault of their own, for no behavioral differences of their own, that is resulting in this. So let's talk for just 1 minute about what we can do about it. And I'm hoping our next speaker is going to focus a lot more on this. But the first thing is, clearly there is bias in the system, in our everything from the individual level kind of to the systemic level. And nobody is immune. Every single person, it's a part of the human condition, has bias, and we all kind of breathe the same air, right? So ensuring that implicit bias and racial equity training is a part of orientation when someone is hired, and a continuous training and topic of professional development is key. My friend and colleague, Dr. Rosemary Allen, who speaks extensively on this issue, always says that being aware is halfway there. And so it's critical to kind of keep this at the forefront with continuous coaching, again, on all of these issues. The next piece is really data. If we are not collecting data and disaggregating and parsing it by race, then we are blindfolding ourselves to the issue, and then we're never going to be able to address or fix the issue. We have to be collecting data at the classroom level, at the program level. We have to disaggregate that data by race, and disability, and gender, so that we know continuously, okay, where are disparities and how can we address them? Let's change our policies. Let's host a new professional development. Let's get a coach in here. Let's change our family engagement strategy, because coming in eyes wide open, you can then pinpoint where your problems are and go in and address them. Better working conditions for teachers. It's probably not a surprise for folks in this room, but early childhood teachers are underpaid, underappreciated, overworked, overburdened, and have little access to supports to address a lot of the issues that they come in contact with in the classroom. As you can imagine, we didn't dig into this research, but there's a whole body of research that finds that longer working days with not enough breaks, lack of training, lack of coaching, lack of a helpline to kind of help address children's social emotional development, that is all associated with using harsher punishment, unsurprisingly. If I was an early childhood teacher, and I was for some time, if I was teaching my own child for 10 hours without sufficient breaks or support, it would be a much more challenging environment than if I felt supported and had positive working conditions. And then finally, really working to support all children's social emotional development and providers' mental health, because there's other research that finds that things like depression and anxiety and stress are also associated with pulling out these harsher forms of discipline. So I'm going to leave you with a metaphor that really kind of tries to encapsulate this work and the work of all of us and the work ahead from the Racial Equity Institute in North Carolina. And it goes like this. If you can all kind of close your eyes just for a second and imagine, it's a beautiful day outside. You walk outside, you're in this big field, and you come across this lake. And you find in the lake a dead fish. The fish is belly up. You would probably wonder what happened to that fish, right? You would probably wonder, well, did that fish eat something it shouldn't have eaten? Is that fish sick for some reason? Did it get caught in some kind of fishing material? What happened? What is wrong with that fish? Well, imagine now you walked up to that lake and instead of one fish belly up, you saw half of the fish in that lake belly up. At that point, you would probably stop asking what's wrong with each of these individual fish, and you would probably start wondering if there was something in the lake's water that was making all of these fish sick. Now imagine you continue walking, you come across another lake, and another lake, and another lake, and 10 more lakes. And half of the fish in every lake are floating belly up. Then you would probably stop wondering what was wrong with the water in the first lake, and you would probably start wondering what was wrong with the groundwater. And this metaphor really helps us understand systemic racism, right? We talked today about early childhood education, but the same pattern with Black Americans having poorer outcomes is apparent and is consistent in every system in the United States, from health and education to criminal justice to finance and wealth. As you can see, the red line in no instance appears below the black line. The pattern is consistent across every system. And every system is a lake. And every system is fed by that same groundwater. So as we consider the big task ahead with the preschool to prison pipeline and addressing our part of the pie, right? The early childhood system, all of these pieces are connected and really require kind of a systemic and holistic approach to address. So with that, I'm going to leave you. I wish you a wonderful evening, and I hope you found some of this information helpful. Thank you again for your attention, and I hope you have a good evening.